Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. And welcome to this TDI Sustainability and Asian Development Bank webinar on the responsible sourcing of critical minerals for the clean energy transition in the Asian context. I'm Sarah Wilkinson, Marketing Manager at TDI Sustainability. So in this session, our speakers will be exploring supply and demand of critical minerals across Asia, the challenges that are facing governments to develop resources, access to markets, and ESG standards and regulations. We'll have a particular focus on nickel and copper from the perspective of our speakers. So today's facilitator is my colleague, Soledad Mills. Sol is a Senior Vice President at TDI Sustainability with more than 20 years of experience in the ESG space. So Sol is joined on our panel session and Q&A by our three panelists, who are Cathy Marsh. Cathy joined the ADB in 2018, having spent 25 years in legal private practice, including as a partner of the US law firm Milbank, focusing on development and project financing. She's currently Deputy Director General and Acting Head of ADB's Private Sector Operations Department, based in Manila. We also have Veronique Steukers. So in her role as President of the Nickel Institute, Veronique is responsible for steering its strategic direction and mission to promote the responsible supply of nickel and sustainable development of the industry. She has more than 25 years of experience in regulatory and government affairs. We're also pleased to welcome Dr. Kathleen Turner. Kathleen has more than 15 years of experience leading on non-technical risk management in mining, oil and gas, including social performance, human rights and external affairs. She's currently Global Human Rights Lead for Freeport McMoRan's operations in the Asia Pacific and Europe. So on the screen, you can see the agenda for today's session. We'll start with a brief introduction from Sol, followed by the panel discussion with all of our speakers. Finally, we'll end with a Q&A session where we'll put your questions to the panelists. I will hand over to Sol for our introduction.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the crucial intersection of critical minerals, clean energy, and responsible sourcing in Asia. Today, we'll dive into Asia's pivotal role in shaping the global critical mineral landscape, a role that's growing in importance as we transition to a cleaner energy future. First and foremost, Asia is not just a player, but becoming an integral hub in the global critical mineral supply chain. The region has distinct comparative advantages across extraction, processing, and manufacturing. China is the undisputed leader in critical mineral processing and refining, with over 90% of the world's rare earth elements and battery-grade graphite refining capacity, and 70 to 75% for lithium and cobalt, according to the IEA's latest critical minerals outlook. It also plays a significant role in mining, accounting for over 60% of global rare earth elements output and nearly 90% of natural graphite. Chinese state-owned enterprises are investing in mines abroad, particularly across Africa, Latin America, and Indonesia, often through joint ventures. And as we've seen lately, China is increasingly applying export controls on critical minerals. But Asia, excluding China, is also emerging as a key player in critical mineral mining and processing. Next slide, please. According to the latest IEA report, the region holds 55% of global nickel, 12% of global rare earth elements, 9% of global cobalt, 8% of global graphite. Indonesia and the Philippines currently account for 72% of global nickel output and 14% of global cobalt output. Indonesia in particular is aggressively expanding its capacity with new nickel smelters and boosting cobalt production. Myanmar is also a significant player, ranking as the second largest rare earth elements producer globally after China. Japan and Korea are advancing their refining capacities despite minimal domestic mining, and together they represent approximately 8% of global copper refining. India also has a lot of untapped resource potential, and just recently, in March of this year, India launched an auction for exploration licenses covering 13 mineral blocks, including copper, rare earth elements, and zinc. Governments across Asia are actively implementing policies to develop and secure critical mineral supply chains, and we're seeing an interesting mix of strategies here. For example, prioritization of domestic processing and value addition, often through measures like export restrictions and the development of integrated EV ecosystems. Indonesia's recent amendments to its mining law and proposed progressive royalty system for nickel are prime examples. The Philippines is also moving towards nickel export bans to foster downstream capabilities. Meanwhile, Japan and Korea are focusing on overseas investment, recycling initiatives, and financial support mechanisms like the Japan Organization for Metals and Energy Securities Investments, and dedicated subsidy programs under their Economic Security Promotion Acts. Japan and Korea are also building robust recycling industries for battery minerals. India's National Critical Mineral Mission aims to secure supply, strengthen value chains, and achieve self-sufficiency through ambitious targets for exploration, recycling, and innovation. Central Asia, including Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, are also emerging as a strategic partner, actively engaging in partnerships with consumer nations like Korea and the European Union to enhance critical mineral supplies from existing as well as new sites. So as we move forward in this webinar, let's keep these points in mind. The evolving landscape of critical minerals in Asia presents both significant opportunities and challenges, particularly concerning responsible sourcing and environmental stewardship. We look forward to a discussion on how we can collaboratively ensure a sustainable, secure, and just future for critical mineral supply chains in the region and beyond. So now we'll move on to our panel session. And Cathy, perhaps I'll start with you. What is the Asian Development Bank's general approach to the development of critical minerals in the Asia-Pacific region? And what are the core or strategic pillars of your approach to critical minerals development?
Thank you, Sol, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. So at ADB, our general approach to the development of critical minerals in the Asia-Pacific region, it focuses very much on fostering green growth, as well as industrialization, job creation, and of course, regional economic integration. And this overall approach is the design is to address the pressing need for investment in critical minerals across the whole value chain to meet the surging demand globally for clean energy technologies, advanced electronics, and other essential industries. So, the core themes or pillars of our approach include obviously boosting energy security by ensuring a stable supply of critical minerals that are essential for renewable energy infrastructure, electric vehicles, and smart grid technology as well. Job creation and inclusive growth to support diversified and resilient critical mineral value chains that create jobs and foster inclusive economic growth. Sustainable development, and this is very much, I think, one of the themes of the discussion today, promoting responsible resource extraction and sustainable practices to minimize environmental impact, as well as supporting long-term economic development. And ideally also focusing on regional economic integration to facilitate collaboration between different stakeholders to enhance that regional economic integration, support the overall development of critical mineral supply chains. Thank you, Sol.
Thank you, Cathy. And turning specifically to nickel, Veronique, what are the main challenges companies are facing with regards to sourcing nickel from Asia, or specifically Indonesia and the Philippines? And are there opportunities to mitigate some of these risks?
Thank you, Soledad. And yes, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, wherever you are. Well, the main challenges that we see from Indonesia and the Philippines are really related to the ore body in the region, to the production processes, and to the locations. So the main topics that are raised are always around climate change, carbon footprint, tailings management, biodiversity, water pollution, and many of these can be managed through membership with the Nickel Institute because it speaks directly to the expertise that we have. And what we definitely see is that the stakeholders are generally not that acquainted with nickel. A lot of the companies have only 10 to 15 years experience with nickel. And if you then compare that with the mature nickel producers around the world, knowledge and expertise with respect to nickel specifically, but also with ESG requirements is really lacking. So the first step is really education, making sure that the stakeholders, be it industry, be it authorities, understand nickel, understand the classification of nickel, the challenges that nickel brings, the risks, and how to manage these risks. And well, you're asking, are there ways to be able to mitigate actually some of those challenges? And if you just specifically look at carbon footprint and at tailings management, we know that there are already developments in, for instance, Indonesia, where production processes are switched from intensive pyrometallurgical processes to more to less carbon intensive leaching processes. And tailings management, we know that there are developments as well to see how they can reduce actually the tailings through dry stacking, for instance.
Great, thank you. And maybe turning to you, Kathleen, how is the mining and metals industry addressing ESG requirements from mining to manufacturing to recycling?
Thanks, Sol. I appreciate the questions, and likewise, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone out there. Look, certainly I believe that the industry is collaborating very closely in its value chain, especially with its customers and the broader stakeholder community, basically to define, what is mining responsibly. And, our experience is that this is ongoing work, it's constant effort. But certainly we also believe that it's absolutely critical if we want to succeed in this green energy transition. For us as a business, Freeport, we're a member of numerous industry organisations, and we participate very actively in other organisations. And all of these function to drive sustainability, not only within Freeport as a business, but also across the industry as a whole. So most recently, that dialogue has centered around the ability to drive responsible production globally. And that's through, as we see it, advancing standards such as the Copper Mark. And the Copper Mark, for all those who don't know, is an independent, not-for-profit standards body. And what they've done is develop a comprehensive, responsible production framework that is actually adhered to by approximately 40% of copper miners worldwide. The Copper Mark has been extended to other critical minerals such as nickel, and zinc and molybdenum. And it's interesting, they're working with other mining industries to consolidate standards, which is a very important initiative at this time. And we only think it's going to drive performance globally, and especially to increase trust and transparency in the sector. So we're very much part of this process, and as we go through the process, there's a lot of stakeholder engagement, and we seek to embed, that feedback from stakeholders, from global institutions, non-government organizations, customers, and we really hope, I think ultimately, in amongst all those benefits, is that we hope we can assist governments to encourage miners in country to get certified, to participate, and to help drive that performance in the sector overall. For us in Freeport as a business, we're finding these standards really, really useful. They are useful for embedding responsible mining practices across all of our operations, but especially to establish a consistent set of expectations that, our operations can adopt and implement, and therefore embed these practices within their own systems and due diligence processes.
Terrific, thank you. And back to you, Veronique. How does the Nickel Institute define responsible sourcing, and what are your members doing to advance best practices and demonstrate leadership in ESG?
Thank you. You may hear quite a lot of similarities with what Kathleen has already said as well. Well, responsible sourcing really means that nickel producers take responsibility for their workers, the environment and the communities that are surrounding their facilities. And it really means identifying the hotspots, identifying data gaps and the risks, and in the areas of environment, of sustainability, of social and governance, and making sure to try, well, to mitigate those risks over time. And in 2024, the Nickel Institute drafted sustainability guiding principles, which really provide guidance to the companies in certain areas around ESG. Coming to our members, one of the most relevant ESG risks is climate change, given the high energy and carbon intensity actually of nickel mining and production. And our companies do show that carbon intensity can be reduced actually through, for instance, electrification of processes in combination with the shift to the use of clean electricity. But I think one of the most telling examples is how our smallest member, actually Brazilian Nickel, successfully went through the nickel mark. So Kathleen spoke about the copper mark and about the fact that the copper mark has been extended to nickel, zinc and molybdenum, and the nickel mark has been active since, I think, 2 years right now. And so our smallest member did go through a nickel mark assessment and audit very successfully. And we often hear from companies in Indonesia that there's no responsible sourcing standard, which is suitable for companies that are at the beginning of their nickel journey. But the example of Brazilian Nickel shows that a standard like the nickel mark really provides the necessary flexibility to accommodate both bigger companies, because other companies like Freeport actually have gone through the nickel market as well as very small companies like Brazilian Nickel, who are really only starting production right now.
Great, thank you. And what partnerships is the Nickel Institute forging or seeking to forge with Asian governments, local communities, NGOs, and other industry associations to promote this idea of responsible sourcing and these good practice standards? Do you have examples of successful collaborations in that area?
Yeah, well, so when we look at Asia, you've already mentioned it at the beginning as well. So Indonesia is the major nickel mining region, and China is a major producing region as well as using region. So our focus of outreach is really in these two countries, where we are in touch with government, with academia and the industry, but we also work through ASEAN, for instance, on topics like how to assess and manage risks. And aim of our activities is to demonstrate that responsible mining and production of nickel is a must, but it can also be done as our companies can demonstrate. And as, I mean, again, I come back to the example of Brazilian Nickel. Even if you're only at the beginning of that journey, it is possible to do that also responsibly. And it's also, I think it's important for the companies to understand as well that it is a must to maintain market access to capital and license to operate. So just Indonesia actually for a full week, or we had our board meeting, and so our board members in Indonesia, we met with stakeholders and we also met with institutes and everything to identify topics for further research or cooperation. For instance, a colleague went to the Bandung Institute of Technology, gave a one-on-one course to students there, and there was also discussed potential involvement in field research work that's ongoing in Indonesia. At the end of 2024, we signed a memorandum of understanding with the China Non-Ferrous Metals Technology and Economic Research Institute, I think it's NTE, and So they set up an ESG standard, which is endorsed by the Chinese Non-Ferrous Metals Industry Association. And the objective of that memorandum of understanding is to enhance the ESG performance of the nickel industry by, for instance, introducing ESG-related regulation standards, identifying gaps, key areas for ESG disclosure, and developing nickel-specific ESG reporting guidelines.
Fascinating, thank you. And just one more question for you, Veronique. How is the Nickel Institute supporting these good practices through the expanded value chain? You've talked a bit about mining, but all the way through to processing and finished battery materials, as we're seeing countries like Indonesia heavily investing in downstream processing to produce battery-grade nickel.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, yeah, we said it before, so it's very important for nickel miners and producers to implement ESG standards as quick as possible. And to a certain degree, there is also responsibility further down the supply chain. And some of the ESG standards do cover parts of the only part of the supply chain, while others cover all steps. And for instance, the copper mark, /nickel mark, is a standard, does cover the entire value chain, actually, from mining to refining. So the nickel mark is a product that really can be used and should be of great interest as well for the Indonesian nickel producers and for the Chinese nickel producers that plan, for instance, to produce battery-grade nickel from mining products. It's I've already said it, it's a very practical and flexible standard that can be used by big and small companies, including small companies that are just starting their nickel journey.
Great, thank you so much for that. And then back to you, Cathy. How are the Asian Development Bank's private sector environmental and social safeguard policies, including the recently updated environmental and social framework, being applied and enforced in the context of critical minerals projects, particularly for high impact activities like nickel mining and processing? What are some of the challenges you're seeing in ensuring that there's rigorous implementation of these safeguards on the ground?
So thank you for the question, Sol. So at ADB, we currently have our policy is called our safeguards policy at the moment. You're absolutely right that we have a new environmental and social framework that has been approved by our board, and that will become effective from the 1st of January 2026. And for private sector investments, it's no different to any other investment that ADB does. Any investment by ADB must comply with our safeguard policy statement, which is our current policy, and moving forward, it will have to comply with our environmental and social framework. And that's in line with all of our peer organizations, multilateral development banks, development finance institutions, and so on and so forth. We all have very similar requirements. So when you ask about in the context of nickel, for example, we do not currently have any investments in the sector, in the nickel sector. However, it would not be treated differently to any other investment that we make in terms of the general application of our policy requirements around environmental and social standards that we do require adherence to. I think obviously the mining is it brings with it higher risks from those perspectives, and it would therefore invite higher scrutiny also. And how we operate, and again how our peer institutions operate, we have essentially a tiering system of the least disruptive from an ESG perspective through to the most disruptive. And an actual mining activity would very clearly fall in the highest category. And so what does that mean overall? What that means is that at ADB, we would work with the company who's undertaking the development to identify key and specific challenges. We would require regular monitoring. We would require regular site visits. And we would require very frequent reporting on compliance with our policy standards as well. And through all of this, what we are trying to do is we are trying to create a license to operate, essentially, for for the companies that we work with, because I think a strong social license to operate is really important in this space, particularly sort of at the top of the supply chain, the extraction phase. And I think we can all point to examples of mining done poorly from that perspective. And fortunately, I think we can all also identify examples of mining done very well from that perspective. And the strength of doing mining very well from an ESG perspective, mining done well is, in my view, it has this, it just has the most extraordinary development impact overall on, both the local community where the mine is located, and that development impact, spreads out more broadly as well. And I think there's nothing quite like it from that, immediate positive development impact perspective. It is, of course, a big risk as well. ESG issues typically would be considered the biggest risk to mining businesses. There's heavy scrutiny from all manner of stakeholders, and that means it creates challenges for the companies who are tasked with implementing ESG requirements from organizations such as ADB. But I think also it means that companies who do it well, who are committed to that as well, it brings reward. I mean, mining in particular, it requires significant capital. It's a very significant capital investment up front in uncertain times, and that can change markets as well. And mining is a longer term investment horizon. And so having that base certainty of being able to reach to organizations with strict requirements, for support in that, and that's at all sorts of levels, from initial, from financing through to, there might be certain policy or regulatory interventions that would assist the industry overall. Being prepared and open and committed to adopting rigorous, I would say, ESG standards in operations, I think is absolutely critical to that as well. And I think we're also seeing this, of course, now through regulation elsewhere. Look at the in the downstream markets. The European Union, for example, very stringent due diligence requirements, coming in around responsible sourcing, and companies need to be able to respond to demands such as that as well. And particularly as demand grows, I think that there's ongoing growing demand for certain key minerals. We all know that, and that demand shows no signs of slowing down, in the years to come, given the priority of the green transition also.
Great, thank you. And I think you've answered this to some degree, but how are standards and regulations being built into the Asian Development Bank's private sector approach? And is there an opportunity for ADB to support adoption of higher standards or better practices in areas where there's typically been lower uptake, or where there are less legal requirements to adopt good ESG practices?
Yeah, no, so thank you for that question, Sol. I mean, from our perspective, every company that we look to support would obviously have to comply with local legal requirements, but as you say, there will be jurisdictions in our region where there are fewer, let's say, domestic legal requirements, in the ESG arena, and this is really where our own policies come to the fore, because our own policies do not flex to reduce the standards that we require for the local legal environment. We will always require compliance with our standards, even where our standards go significantly above and beyond what would otherwise be required in the particular domestic setting, and that's regardless of the industry. So I think that in our view, this adherence to our requirements, above everything else, that does help elevate practices, particularly in environments where there is little else to govern on these areas. And we see that actually as a real value add from our perspective. Some of the companies that we work with, may see it as us having an endless list of requirements. But I think that the overall effect is an incredibly positive one. And I mean, I have had very large companies say to me very specifically how much they have actually valued our input and our intervention in the ESG space, because they thought they were doing really well, and then we sort of come along and say, well, actually, here's an area you might want to focus on a little bit more, because we would like to see you elevate up your game, as it were, in that particular area. And many companies actually really welcome that approach as well. They see the value and the benefit.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So yeah, I think a good example of that is probably Freeport. So back to you, Kathleen. What strategies does Freeport employ to address this social environmental impacts of operations in the region, and what are some lessons learned that could be applied more broadly?
Yeah, thanks, Sol. And perhaps I sort of preface my answer of, saying that, our operations in the region, our Grasberg operations in Papua, we work in a very unique operating environment. There's a lot of complexity, socio-culturally, socio-politically, and even in terms of, our operations and its magnitude. We're working in a 60-year legacy. And so, in the context of risks and opportunities, there's quite a lot of positive stories there to tell how we have adapted to that change, and matured our processes that are more fit for purpose in managing those risks. So I just wanted to sort of put that in itself into context. So one of the, I suppose, internal processes that we have, which is the foundation, you could say, for addressing our social environmental risks. I'm referring to our sustainability risk register. And that really functions to drive a consistent approach to mitigating, managing our most material or significant risks. And at Grasberg, this is including our lowlands operation, our highlands operation, and this is done on an ongoing basis. So the risk register prioritizes those risks which have the most, I suppose, negative consequences. And importantly, not only to our business operations, but those risks that are posed to our local communities, risks to human rights, environmental management, risks to our community development, social investment activities, and related economic impacts. So how that works internally, we have quarterly risk review meetings where the risk owners from various departments and divisions present their risks that are relevant to their portfolio to senior leadership and gain their feedback, not only on those risks, the extent by which we need to calibrate those within very much an evolving environment and landscape, but also presenting those action plans associated with those risks, which manifest as the controls or the due diligence systems that we have in place to mitigate and manage those risks. So the risk register is actually defined by our operating shareholder, that's Freeport, McMoRan, and we have a risk assessment matrix which assesses risk by likelihood and consequence, and these are based on customized definitions across different functional areas. And the last point I want to make about the sustainability risk register, it is mapped on our external commitments. So that includes the ICMM performance expectations, the copper mark requirements, and in parallel to that, to our commitments in our public policy and governance framework. So we do believe this is probably, a really good foundation and success story for us. As I mentioned, working in a very complex and unique environment.
Thank you. That's really interesting to see how you're integrating risk management internally all the way up to senior leadership. And then related to that, what are some examples of good practices that Freeport has adopted in Asia, or specifically in Grasberg, and how could these be replicated?
Yeah, thanks, Sol. And I say or emphasize again, we probably have a lot of good success stories. We have invested quite well and learned quite a lot over a 60-year legacy environment and adapted to that. But what I believe is probably a great example that has been really successful in the context, I guess, of how have we been meeting the skills demand of the business, including our contractor companies, and at the same time providing pathways to employment, fostering personal development and growth for our Indigenous communities, as well as strengthening cultural identity. So we've managed to sort of find a formula to do that. And briefly, I'd like to talk about our Nemankawi Institute. So we founded the Nemankawi Institute in 2003. It is an educational institute located on site at Grasberg. It offers dynamic training programs, both technical and non-technical. And this is especially targeted towards our Papuan communities. And interestingly, I would say then, when I talk about a unique operating environment, our Indigenous stakeholders actually comprise the majority of our stakeholders in the region, as opposed to, I guess, how that looks like in other operations globally. And they also actually comprise the majority stakeholder in our local government as well, which is interesting. So the Nemankawi Institute essentially provides apprenticeship training and furthers employment opportunities for our local Papuans in their field of interest. So the Institute in that respect offers non-degree apprenticeship training in the fields of, for example, welding, equipment maintenance, electrical, general mining. And essentially, this is intended to meet this ongoing skills demand of the business, but also, like I said, for the skills demand that our contractor companies has as well. And proudly, we can say, definitely as a success story, since its inception in 2003, we have had approximately 4,000 graduate apprentices, and of those, about 2,900 have been or have found full-time employment with PT Freeport Indonesia, or have been placed with our contractor companies, and 93% of them have been local Papuans. So again, something that we're very proud of, which has, found, I suppose, success in meeting that nexus between skill demand and developing the capacity of our local stakeholders from the ground up.
Thank you. That's a great success story. Very interesting. One more question for you, Kathleen, and then we can open it up for the audience Q&A. What kinds of trends are you seeing in terms of questions or requirements that come from your downstream customers?
Look, I think we do have, that KYC process. We enter into commercial arrangements, and we have our necessary KYC questionnaire, which is exchanged. And more recently, I was talking to our sales and marketing team in Indonesia. And from my standpoint, which has certainly piqued my interest, there have been quite a bit of scrutiny, I guess, to attain confidence in our due diligence practices in the human rights agenda. And I think there's been some interrogation there as well, to the extent that Freeport, exercises or demonstrates that type of due diligence and the maturity of its systems. And Freeport, as a convention, implements human rights impact assessment across all of its operations. And we can certainly testify, at Grasberg in 2023, this was the largest, due diligence of, human rights for an extractive company in Indonesia, after BHP in Kalimantan in 2018 and BP Tangguh in Papua, I think it was in 2002. So it was a mammoth exercise, but again, it went to the extent of, more or less getting our house in order, and ensuring that, we had the due diligence systems in place to demonstrate that we were, or we are looking to address our human rights related risks according to our landscape. So, that's just to put it in context, but, these are the type of, I suppose, questions that are coming from our customers. We find that we feel, they want to find confidence in as they look to see how companies like us are trying to manage our longer term ESG risks. So certainly that's something I picked up.
Interesting. Thank you so much for those insights. We'll start with a couple of questions from the registration, and then we'll get to the live audience questions. But one of the questions we got was about the implementation of IRMA, or the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, in Southeast Asia. And I'll hand that one to Veronique.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think IRMA exists since about 20 years probably, and to our knowledge, less than 10 companies have been able or were audited against IRMA globally. Most of them were in Africa and South America, actually. So I know that some companies are working on assessing IRMA also in Indonesia. Just as companies are working on other standards as well, basically. To be honest, I mean, when you look at the comparison of the standards, and many comparisons have been done, all standards have exactly the same 34 impact categories. Some standards are just a little bit more detailed in explanations or in requirements than other standards are. And we believe it's very important for companies to go through a standard. And it doesn't matter which standard it is, but they should do it now, and they should do it quickly. Cathy spoke about regulatory requirements. We all know that the EU battery regulation has due diligence requirements that now will enter into force in 2 years' time rather than this year in August. But 2 years is a very short time frame, basically. And so the nickel mark, for instance, allows companies to go through that assessment and audit and be ready for compliance with external requirements, also requirements from the value chain, who I think want to understand now whether the companies understand their processes and know what their data gaps are and the hotspots are and what they're doing to mitigate those risks rather than knowing this in 5 years' time.
Great, thank you. And another question was around the role of traceability in critical minerals supply chains, and what are some solutions or traceability requirements, specifically in the context where companies in the supply chain might not always be willing to share information. So maybe I'll hand that one to Kathleen, if you have any examples of that.
Yeah, thanks, Sol. Veronique refers to IRMA, and I think, as the focus of Freeport is globally is copper production. So we have elected to implement the copper mark, and it's been quite a continuous journey for us, a 5-year journey, and something that we're committed to going on. So just to frame that, all of our operational sites are certified with the copper mark, and that's where we are assured by a third party against 33 criteria, and that's intended to demonstrate our maturity of business to manage what's been referred to as long-term ESG risks. And as Cathy mentioned earlier, particularly in uncertain times, we have an evolving environment, and how do we manage those risks, particularly against international standards and what the expectations are. So I think in this way, as we go through those type of external assurance processes through Copper Mark, we are demonstrating to customers and investors how we are meeting what Copper Mark has as risk readiness criteria. There's 33 criterion, and to give customers and investors that greater clarity and confidence of our performance, and also significantly of our preparedness to adapt to this shift that we're seeing in the energy transition and the expectations associated with that.
Great, thank you. And a broader question, what ESG frameworks are applied in sourcing critical minerals? Maybe Veronique, I'll hand that one to you.
Sure. Well, I can speak for nickel, I guess, but I think it's very much the same for other materials as well. So it's a little bit of everything, really. So we have the ICMM performance standard. There is IRMA, which we've already talked about. There's RMI. There's nickel mark. There's towards sustainable mining from the Mining Association of, well, the Canadian one. And some of these, I think, have been adopted really more, how to say it, more locally, like when we talk about TSM. So it's a Canadian mining standard, but it's been adopted by Finland. It has been adopted by the Philippines Mining Association. The thing is that we know that there are discussions, or have been discussions in Indonesia, but also in China, that they should develop their own mining standard or their own responsible sourcing standard, which I think everyone here around the table would say, no, we don't want that. Our members, Nickel Institute members, are already faced with different requirements from different stakeholders. And as I said before, many of those standards, well, all of those standards really tackle exactly the same impact categories. So there should be at least cross-recognition, if not consolidation, and that consolidation is ongoing, as Kathleen already referenced a little bit earlier as well, to avoid that companies have to go through 101 different assessment and audits for all their different stakeholders, resulting in exactly actually the same outcome.
Great, thank you for that. So now maybe we will turn to some of the audience questions. I think we've got quite a few for Kathleen, perhaps. How can producers like Freeport work with government to strengthen environmental and social governance practices in the industry? That one I would turn to Kathleen for.
Yeah, look, I think what's happening at the moment, there's quite a few challenges, given the, energy transition at the moment, and again, the expectations associated with that of the mining industry. But I think the one that we're looking at, and to the extent that we can engage with its government, is how this shift is stress testing a socially responsible market. And as I said earlier, investors are seeking greater clarity and confidence in mining operators like us as to, how do we account for long-term risks and opportunities as we adapt to this energy transition. Clearly, the challenge for us, and well, not only us, I suppose, across the industry, and one which we're cognizant of that governments really need to, exercise scrutiny over as well, is that we're entering a unique phase where we're trying to look for the optimal standards that on one hand, addresses our social environmental risks, protects human rights, but at the same time, trying to meet the demand for a product that is required for renewable energies and green hydrogen production. And clearly, Indonesia is seen as an attractive market. We've got Myanmar, the Philippines, Malaysia, all, endowed with rich reserves of critical minerals. And they also, as a result, have become a critical part of the supply chain, particularly when there are, supply chain disruptions. We've seen that sort of disruption, in the contemporary landscape at the moment, but, example of this was, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And, certainly, we've been working with the regulators. We all know that, in Indonesia, knowing that, for example, knowing very clearly, and I think Cathy mentioned it earlier, inevitably mining has impacts. And when we work in geographies where there often can be poor public governance, corruption. We can be operating in conflict affected areas. And we acknowledge as well that mining can employ, select employees from vulnerable communities, migrants and minorities. And the work of mining itself is dangerous. So, the Indonesian government, we're working in this region. We all know this is changing the business risk landscape. And we want to be able to, work with government. And certainly, as I mentioned, through, these sort of standards that we are, we're certified against, we're hoping that that lubricates a conversation with Indonesia to support them, in helping the industry overall get certified and increase performance, in the sector overall. And I've had, conversations with our sales and marketing team and general leadership in Freeport. We're aware of the, accession discussions of Indonesia wanting to become a member of the OECD, and therefore, expectations associated with, the responsible business conduct for multinationals, and to the extent that that will, impose conditions upon Indonesia to encourage mining companies like us to meet those requirements. So again, you know, we're engaging with government on all those topics, very conscious that, you know, we want to participate in that kind of dialogue and encourage performance overall. Indonesia wants to attract investment and likewise, so I think it deserves that kind of collaborative partnership.
Great, thank you so much for that, Kathleen. So another question around whether there are regulations or frameworks to keep companies mining of critical minerals or rare earth elements in check in conflict-affected regions, keeping in mind that mining may lead to recurrence of violence. I'll throw that one to Veronique.
Thank you. Yeah, so as Nickel Institute, we do follow regulation as well very closely at global level. I'm not that familiar with regulations, but I know that there is like the conflict minerals regulation in the EU. There's the Dodd-Frank Act in the US. They are specifically for the EU. It's I think the US as well. I'm not sure actually, but it's specifically for gold, tin, tungsten, and tantalum. In the EU, more minerals may be added in the future. So yes, there are regulations in place. I don't know the details of those regulations.
Great, thank you. And then there's a question around standards. As a copper fabricator located in an industrial estate with no community living nearby, how do we analyze the risk of our operations to community biodiversity, etc., with respect to compliance with the Copper Mark? So maybe I could take that one. As TDI, we do lots of assessments of companies all along the supply chain against Copper Mark as well as other standards. And broadly speaking, Copper Mark will be looking to see that you've evaluated potential impacts, even if there are not communities nearby. There may be communities who are indirectly impacted by, for example, materials arriving or leaving the facility. And so all along that route, there could be impacts depending on how those materials are coming in and out of the industrial estate. That could also impact biodiversity in regions that may be far from the actual facility, but because of the incoming and outgoing materials could still have an impact. And waste management is also important here, because if there are discharges through air emissions or through wastewater disposal, that could have cumulative impacts on the broader ecosystem that your facility is part of. So Copper Mark would be looking to see that you've kind of done an analysis of what those cumulative impacts could look like. And then in terms of communities, if there are no communities nearby, your employees and contractors would be your key kind of community stakeholder, and perhaps their families, depending on where those employees and contractors live. Sometimes accommodation is provided on site or nearby. In that case, you also have the extended families of these workers who might constitute a community, even if it's not a formal town, shall we say. So Copper Mark will be looking to see how you've addressed those issues related to their health and safety, fair labor practices, and human rights. And then lastly, Copper Mark would also look at the supply chain. So maybe if there are not direct impacts on biodiversity or communities from your facility, there may be impacts from your supply chain where your raw materials are coming from upstream. So Copper Mark really emphasizes the need for you to do due diligence throughout your supply chain. So I hope that helps to answer the question, but I'm happy if anyone else on the panel wants to add to that. Okay, so then moving on to the next one. Kathleen, I think you've mentioned this a little bit in your example of good practices in Grasberg, but how does Freeport engage with Indigenous peoples and local communities, and how do you ensure local community fair benefit sharing?
Yeah, look, thanks, Sol. Look, I mentioned earlier, we have a very unique operating environment in Grasberg. And, you know, when I talked about the Nemankawi Institutes and training Indigenous persons, you know, that it is an interesting fact that, you know, our Indigenous peoples are the majority stakeholder in the communities surrounding our operations, but also amongst our local government leaders as well. We do have what we call the 7 major ethnic groups closest to our operations. So we have the Amongme in the highlands, and we have the Komoro in the lowlands, and we have 5 other ethnic groups close by, and all of which colloquially we refer to as the Tuju Suku, which essentially means the 7 ethnic groups. And so we work very closely with these Indigenous groups. An example of this where we feel we have really sought to work towards FPIC, for example, which I know is we're very much committed to, you know, as articulated in our social performance policy, and our commitment to the ICMM's position statement. But in in 2020, we went through an extensive FPIC process as part of our mine expansion permitting process. And we work very comprehensively with our Indigenous stakeholders, their representative organisations, you know, through those engagement activities where we felt that, you know, there was a likelihood of impact. And I would say in parallel to that, we have our sustainability and community relations team on site. Consists of 600 staff, 53% are local Papuan, and they are responsible for managing and coordinating community development projects with other departments. But, you know, they're literally involved in regular meetings daily. And you know, quite literally hundreds of these meetings through the community liaisons officers, through our various managers who are responsible for, you know, areas of cultural heritage, again, community development activities. And they're always, you know, been invested for a very, very long time, you know, since, you know, again, I talk about that legacy environment, inevitably engaging with these stakeholders, developing very positive relationships and ensuring that, you know, consultation is meaningful for both parties.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. Okay, let's see what other questions we have. Yes, another one on standards. How is the concept of full value mining incorporated into the standards you're using? How important is the recovery of byproducts from, for example, copper or nickel mines to increase resource efficiency? I can partially answer when it comes to standards, but happy for anyone to jump in to provide any additional insights from examples of what you've seen. But I think the concept of full value mining is maybe not explicitly included in standards, but standards like the Copper Mark and IRMA do place a heavy emphasis on resource efficiency and circularity. So that includes managing resources and energy consumption more efficiently, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, waste management and wastewater management, and land use and biodiversity aspects. But I think also more critically, the more recent emphasis that we've seen in the updates to these standards in the last few years has been a much more of an emphasis on circular economy principles. So that includes recovering byproducts, which is one of the core tenets of circularity. And this is obviously a great business case for companies because it helps them minimize waste and keep more valuable materials in circulation. So that's something we've seen increasingly emphasized in the more recent versions of these standards. Does anyone else want to comment on this?
Yeah, I can definitely add maybe a little bit. So what we've seen in Indonesia is definitely that there is a lot of recovery actually of the byproducts also through the tailings management. So that's part of that tailings management and reducing the tailings. I even understand that there are developments now to remove all the iron as well from the tailings. So the tailings are really reduced with, I don't know, up to 80% or something like that. Well, there's a lot of cobalt that comes with nickel in Indonesia specifically, and it really comes back again to what I've said before with respect to standards as well. It's exactly the same mining operation, but companies are then faced with a specific standard for nickel and yet another standard for cobalt when a lot of the processes actually are very similar. And so it doesn't really make sense to go through 2 or 3 or 4 different standards just because you produce different minerals. So this cross-recognition is very important, or consolidation of standards, but definitely not developing even more standards.
Absolutely. Great. Well, there was another comment, more of a comment than a question, to say this is an interesting and important discussion. There are considerable learnings in terms of supply chain certification and ESG standards in relation to critical minerals in Indonesia and the Asia Pacific from the sustainable palm oil sector. So that's thank you for that comment. I think that's good to have cross-sector learnings as well, and that is an area that may be a bit more advanced when it comes to implementing standards. So with that, I will draw the Q&A to a close. I'll just mention there were some questions around the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, the EU Conflict Minerals Regulation, Dodd-Frank, etc. We have quite a lot of resources on the TDI website related to that, so we'll be sure to include those links in the final resources that are sent around. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions, and I'd like to also thank our speakers and the audience for your insights and participation. So as we've heard in the discussion, it's very clear that addressing critical mineral needs for clean energy technologies is paramount and important for boosting energy security and fostering sustainable, inclusive growth. We talked about how crucial responsible resource extraction is, with industry leaders and standards like the Copper Mark and IRMA driving best practices in areas like climate change mitigation, tailings management, biodiversity protection, and circularity. Through collaboration, rigorous ESG standards, and robust stakeholder engagement, as well as applying international standards around human rights, such as free, prior, and informed consent for Indigenous peoples, we can ensure sustainable development and maximize long-term positive impact of mining for communities and the environment. And this requires engagement across mining companies, financial institutions like the Asian Development Bank, as well as NGOs, communities, and international organizations. So here are some additional resources. These are on the screen now. We'll paste them into the Q&A, and we'll send a follow-up in the next week or so with these resources included. I'll just ask now for each of the panelists to share some final closing remarks, maybe starting with you, Veronique.
Yeah, thank you very much. I will try to make this very short. It was a very interesting discussion, and what I definitely felt very interesting is how, as Nickel Institute, we really tackle a lot of the topics that have been raised today. For instance, Kathleen talked about risk register, internal risk register, which we as Nickel Institute also have, which our members can tap into, and it's specifically with respect to risk and opportunities for nickel. And Cathy spoke about regulation and increasing regulatory requirements at global level, which as Nickel Institute we also work on. And then I also spoke about all the challenges and everything that speak directly to actually the expertise that the Nickel Institute has. And so we really believe it is important to encourage companies in Indonesia and in China to also join the Nickel Institute. So companies that are involved in nickel mining, production, refining, and recycling, because so we can tackle the challenges really jointly, because they do impact the sector as a whole, basically. So just anyone interested in knowing more about the Nickel Institute and membership can contact me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Veronique. And Kathleen?
Yeah, look, I just want to say first up, thank you to Sol and TDI for the opportunities to speak today. And likewise, I just want to echo Veronique's, sentiments that, this has been a very interesting discussion, and I've learned a lot from Veronique's and Cathy's insights. And certainly I hope to sort of, within the discussion, leverage off that and provide some narrative about what happens at the coalface and on the ground, particularly in complex operating environments. And some of the, those stories where, we have adapted, to these evolving shifts. There's no off-the-shelf approach as such, and, everything is, designed for fit for purpose. And certainly we've strived to do that. And so, at the end of the day, I was very happy to be, part of this and, open to contributing to these sort of discussions in the future. So thank you again.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. And Cathy.
Thank you, Sol. And yes, adding, my thanks to TDI for organising the panel. And, it's been a really interesting conversation today. And I am also going to comment on the fact that we are an all-woman panel discussing, mining, which I just think is absolutely terrific. So, I mean, from my perspective at ADB, obviously Asia Pacific, sits right at the center of the global critical minerals transition. It's got huge reserves that are essential for clean energy and other green technologies that are vital for the global goal of the green transition, carbon reduction, and combating climate change. And from our perspective, at ADB, our approach on critical minerals is entwined with the overall clean energy transition, as we've all talked somewhat on in our discussion today, while simultaneously really wanting to ensure that the extraction and other steps involved through the supply chain are done in a responsible manner, both environmentally and socially. And by doing that, working in partnership with everyone, then this is how we create inclusive growth, as well as driving energy security and the overall clean transition. And I think it's a super exciting time actually for all of us who touch this industry at any point along the supply chain for it. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what we all can collectively achieve in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cathy, and thank you again to all of our speakers. So with that, I'll thank everyone again and wish you a good day, afternoon, evening. Thank you so much. Goodbye.